3,000 alien warships appeared over Texas at 7:43 in the morning, and the first human response wasn't a missile, wasn't a prayer, and wasn't a panic. It was a gas station cashier named Earl who looked up at the sky, spit tobacco juice onto the pavement, and said, "Well, I still got to open what you're about to." Here is the complete unfiltered account of the 48 hours that changed the Galactic Dominion's entire understanding of what humanity actually is. You're going to find out why the aliens specifically chose Texas, what happened when their invasion force landed in a Bass Pro Shops parking lot, and why the single most terrifying military report in the known galaxy was filed by a retired school librarian named Doris. This isn't a story about heroism. It's not a story about sacrifice. It's a story about what happens when a civilization that has conquered 47 worlds makes one catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot what day it was. The Galactic Dominion had been watching Earth for 63 years. 63 years of observation drones, deep cover surveillance satellites, intercepted communications, and detailed behavioral modeling. They were by any objective measure extraordinarily thorough. Their invasion doctrine was refined across 4 decades of conquest. You find the population center, you appear in overwhelming force above the largest metro area, you broadcast a surrender demand in the native language, and you wait for the inevitable collapse of morale and social cohesion. It had worked on the silicon-breathing Veth of Proxima 5. It had worked on the hive mind crustaceans of the Kepler belt. It had worked on 17 separate species before anyone had even figured out what those species looked like. Supreme Admiral Vra Kindra reviewed the plan one final time aboard the Eternal Dominion flagship. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 3,000 warships would decloak simultaneously above the continent designated North America, specifically over the region called Texas, which their intelligence had determined was the spiritual and psychological heartland of the most militaristic nation-state on the planet. If you shatter the will of the warriors, the rest fall in days. This was doctrine. This was history. This was science. What their 63 years of surveillance had somehow failed to fully account for was the specific cultural weight of a Monday morning in late October, when the Dallas Cowboys had lost to the Eagles the night before. Deer season opened in 4 days, and half the adult male population of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex had already been awake since 5 in the morning, arguing about offensive line decisions. On Facebook, the ships decloaked at 7:43 a.m. Central Time, 3,000 vessels, each one larger than a city block, materializing from nothing in a perfect formation that blotted out the sky from Amarillo to Beaumont. The light they cast turned the whole Texas landscape purple and gold, which coincidentally were LSU colors, and which caused at least 47 separate Twitter arguments about whether this was some kind of stunt before anyone acknowledged there might be aliens involved. The invasion broadcast went out across every radio frequency, every television channel, and every cell tower simultaneously. The Supreme Admiral's translated voice filled every speaker in the state. People of Texas, you are now under the authority of the Galactic Dominion. Lay down your arms, surrender your infrastructure, and you will be processed with efficiency. Resistance is statistically futile, and Then they waited for the collapse of morale. They waited 4 minutes. What they got instead was 847,000 simultaneous phone calls to 911, none of which were panic screaming, and most of which were people asking if this counted as a valid reason to leave work early. Here's the part the Galactic Dominion's behavioral models got completely wrong, and it's not what you'd expect. They had modeled for fear. They had modeled for aggression. They had modeled for worship and for denial. What they had never in 63 years managed to model for was pure uncut weaponized annoyance. The Advanced Landing Force was instructed to secure a large, strategically significant structure as a forward command position. Their targeting algorithms identified the largest freestanding building in a central location with maximum symbolic value, heavy foot traffic, and what appeared to be a significant stockpile of supplies and equipment. What the algorithm saw as the perfect forward base was in fact the Bass Pro Shops outdoor world in Garland, Texas, which at 7:45 on a Monday morning already had a parking lot that was 30% full. The first dropship descended through the clouds like a chrome thunderhead, 400 ft of alien warcraft settling onto the Bass Pro parking lot with a sound like a god clearing his throat. The landing ramp descended 32 Dominion shock troopers in full combat armor, creatures that looked like what you'd get if a rhinoceros and a scorpion had an argument that turned into a science project. Marched out in perfect formation. Their commander, a battle-hardened veteran of 11 conquests named Commander Thoth, took his first steps on Earth soil and surveyed his surroundings with the practiced eye of a conqueror. He was immediately nearly hit by a Ford F-250 backing out of a parking space. The driver, a man named Randy, who was 72 years old and had been coming to this Bass Pro Shops every single Monday for 9 years to browse the fishing lures and drink the free coffee they give out near the back, rolled down his window, looked at the 32 alien shock troopers now blocking his exit, and said, "Y'all going to move or what, Commander?" Thoughtville consulted his translation matrix. The words were clear. The intent was clear. What was not clear was how a single unarmed elderly biped was addressing 32 armed soldiers in a tone that suggested mild inconvenience rather than existential terror. He raised his weapon, a plasticaster capable of reducing a tank to vapor, and pointed it at Rye's windshield. Randy looked at the weapon. He looked at the alien holding it. He looked back at the weapon. He then rolled his window back up, finished backing out, and drove around the drop ship to park in a different spot. That was humanity's first one-on-one contact with the Galactic Dominion. Inside the Bass Pro Shops, the invasion proceeded according to doctrine. For approximately 11 minutes, the shock troopers entered in combat formation, announced their authority over the facility, and ordered all occupants to the floor. About 40% of the people inside lay down. The other 60% did not out of bravery, but because they were either too far away to hear the announcement clearly over the fishing podcast playing on the overhead speakers, or because they were in the middle of trying on waders and physically couldn't. The critical miscalculation happened when 4 troopers attempted to secure the firearms display. The Dominion's invasion doctrine was very clear about The importance of seizing local weapons. Caches immediately, the doctrine had been written for civilizations where weapons were held in government armories, military bases, or secured behind significant bureaucratic barriers. The doctrine had not been written for a civilization where a single retail location in suburban Texas contained at that specific moment more firearms than the entire standing army of the vet of Proxima 5, Commander. Thothrell stared at the wall of guns. Then he stared at the floor-to-ceiling rack of ammunition behind it. Then he looked at the man behind the counter, a store associate named Dale, who was 58, missing 2 fingers from a table saw incident in 2019, and who had in the 9 minutes since the alien ships appeared taken approximately 3 sips of his coffee and not yet called anyone. Is this Commander Thoth said through his translator, your weapons storage facility, that's the hunting and shooting section, Dale said. Y'all here for a sale? Dale's question kicked off the 26-minute conversation that Dominion analysts would later classify as Contact File 0, the first documented evidence that the species they had come to conquer might require a fundamentally different approach, because Dale wasn't scared. Dale was curious, and a curious Texan with nothing else to do on a Monday morning is one of the most formidable conversational forces in the known universe. Dale asked about their propulsion system. He asked what caliber their Plasek casters were equivalent to. He asked if they'd eaten yet, because there was a Whataburger 2 lots over, and he could watch the register if they wanted to go. Commander Thothel filed a separate incident report about the Whataburger conversation that his superiors marked as corrupted data and refused to log. While all of this was happening, the United States military was doing what the United States military does, which is to say holding meetings, a lot of meetings, an extraordinary number of meetings for a situation that seemed from the outside to demand immediate decisive action. There were 3 simultaneous emergency sessions at the Pentagon, 1 at Northcom, 2 separate classified calls between the Joint Chiefs, and a conference call with the White House that was briefly crashed by someone from the Department of Agriculture who had been forwarded the wrong dial-in number and spent 4 minutes asking about a grant program before anyone figured out what was happening. But while Washington was generating paperwork, Texas was doing something different. By 8:15 a.m., 32 minutes after the ships appeared, a loose, informal, completely organic coalition had already formed across 14 counties. It wasn't a militia in any organized sense. It wasn't a government response. It was just people who had woken up early, seen the ships, decided that whatever this was, they weren't going to wait around for someone in D.C. to handle it, and had started texting their neighbors. The man generally credited with organizing this response was not a general, not a politician, and not a law enforcement officer. He was a 55-year-old high school football coach named Bert Mallister, who coached the La Mesa Tornadoes and who had over 27 years of coaching, developed what his players described as an almost supernatural ability to look at absolute chaos and immediately figure out what needed doing. Bert had looked at the ships, looked at his phone, seen that his buddy Dave, who had landed out by Sweetwater, was already watching a Dominion dropship try to navigate a cattle gate, and had started making calls. By 9:00 a.m., Bert's informal network had connected. Ranchers, volunteer firefighters, game wardens, 3 county sheriffs, a retired Army Ranger who now ran a barbecue restaurant in Abilene, and somewhere around 400 regular people who had grabbed guns, trucks, and snacks and driven toward the alien activity, because that just seemed like the thing to do, not away from it, toward it. The Dominion surveillance drones flagged this movement pattern as an anomaly 3 separate times before a senior analyst noted in a message that would later become famous in Dominion intelligence circles that the humans appeared to be voluntarily approaching the invasion force with no apparent military coordination and no apparent fear, and that she was not sure how to categorize this behavior, but it did not appear in any of their existing threat models. The Galactic Dominion's surveillance satellites picked up the gathering force and flagged it to Supreme Admiral Vrakindra. The admiral studied the readouts. The gathered humans had weapons, yes, but they were primitive, ballistic, chemical propellant devices, nothing that could threaten Dominion armor. The vehicles were unarmored personal transports. There was no command and control hierarchy visible in their communications, which the intelligence analysts interpreted as disorganization, but which was actually just how Texans communicate when they're all already on the same page. Admiral sent down a diplomatic emissary, a Dominion first talker named Select Proth, to meet the gathering humans and explain calmly and rationally that further resistance was pointless. Select Proth landed in a meadow outside Abilene and was met by Bert, a sheriff's deputy named Carmela, and Randy, who had apparently followed the situation across 2 counties just to see how it was going. Select delivered the standard capitulation speech. He explained the Dominion's 47 conquests. He outlined the processing system for newly acquired populations. He expressed genuine diplomatic interest in a peaceful transition. He was for an alien emissary. Quite charming. He spoke for 6 minutes. When he finished, Bert said, "So what do you actually want?" Select Proth blinked his secondary eye. "Cluster your planet," said Bert. He thought about this for a moment. No, there was a pause. "Oh, you don't understand," Sellecroth said. "We have 3,000 warships. You got a lot of ships." Bert agreed. "How many of them you willing to lose?" "One, Hamza." That was not a question that appeared anywhere in the Dominion's diplomatic response database. Select PRTH later described the silence that followed as the longest 3 seconds of his professional career. Not because the question was threatening in a conventional sense. It wasn't. It was the complete unambiguous calm with which it was asked. No bluster, no bravado. Just a man in a polar coaching shirt, standing in a meadow in Texas doing actual math in his head about the exchange rate on warships. The conversation in that meadow lasted 2 hours. Select PRTH filed a report afterward that his superiors initially flagged as a transmission error because several of his conclusions seemed statistically impossible. 1 line in that report would be quoted in Dominion military strategy texts for the next 300 years. They do not appear to calculate acceptable losses. They appear to have removed the concept of acceptable losses from their decision-making architecture entirely. Nobody briefed Doris. That's the first thing to understand. Doris Hendris Walton, 67 years old, retired. School librarian, part-time city council. Member for the town of Meridian, Texas. Population 1,493. Was not part of any military network, any government response chain, or any informal coalition. Doris found out about the invasion the way most people in Meridian found out. Her neighbor, Patty, texted her a photo of the ships in the sky over Waco and added 3 question marks and a skull emoji. What followed was entirely Doris's individual decision-making, and it is, according to the Galactic Dominion's post-invasion analysis, the single most tactically significant sequence of events in the entire 48-hour period. A Dominion survey drone had identified Meridian City Hall and Public Library as administrative infrastructure worth securing. Standard doctrine for establishing local governance displacement. A secondary landing squad of 8 troopers was dispatched. They landed in the town square at 9:30 a.m. and marched toward the library building. Doris was already there. She had beaten them by 20 minutes because she had immediately understood what was in the building and what losing it would mean. Not the books, though she cared deeply about the books. What concerned Doris was that the Meridian Public Library served as the town's emergency communications hub. It had the only hardwired countywide alert system, the backup generator, and 3 large screen systems that the county emergency management office used for coordination. During tornado season, in the 20 minutes before the troopers arrived, she had made 11 phone calls and unlocked the library for 12 residents who now sat inside it with radios, water, and a purpose. When the Dominion troopers reached the front steps, Doris was standing on the porch. She was carrying a cup of tea. She was wearing a cardigan with small embroidered owls on it. She looked at the 8 armored alien soldiers the way she had looked at generations of middle schoolers who thought they were going to make noise in her library. "Can I help you?" Doris said. The squad leader explained they were requisitioning the building. "No," Doris said. The squad leader explained that resistance would be met with force. "I understand that's your position," Doris said. "I'd like you to hear mine." She gestured to the 12 people inside. "This is a public library. It serves the people of this community. You are not permitted in without a library card or a valid reason. You don't have either." She paused. "You're also standing on my good rug, and I'd appreciate if you'd step off it." There was a stunned silence from the 8 armored troopers. "You could burn it down," Doris continued helpfully. "That's an option you have. But I want you to understand what happens next. Every person in this building and every person in this town will understand completely and permanently that you burned down their library, and then you will have to deal with what comes after that." She sipped her tea. "I've met the people in this county. I've known them for 40 years. I've taught their children. I wouldn't recommend it." Stewardy's the squad leader, a veteran of 11 planetary conquests who had once held a forward position against massed armored vehicles for 6 hours, later testified that moment he experienced what Dominion medical science classified as threat recognition cascade, a phenomenon usually reserved for encounters with things like black holes and bioweapon events. He could not identify the specific threat. He could not quantify it. He only knew with the bone-deep certainty of a creature that had survived 11 wars that whatever Doris was Prepared to do next, he did not want to be the one who found out what it was. Laughter. He took his squad and left. Doris held the library for 31 hours. The Dominion's official after-action report listed the Meridian Public Library as an unreachable fortified position due to indeterminate hostile deployment capacity, which was their way of saying they could not figure out what Doris' actual capabilities were, and they were not willing to find out what Doris understood. And what the Galactic Dominion did not was that the library was never the point. The 11 phone calls she made in those 20 minutes had seeded information, resources, and coordination across a 60-mi radius. She hadn't just defended a building, she'd used the building as a platform to organize a response that the Dominion's command structure could never quite locate or target because it had no command structure. It was just people who knew each other doing what needed doing. By hour 18 of the invasion, Supreme Admiral Vrax Kindra had stopped sleeping. This was unusual. The Admiral had overseen 11 conquests with calm professionalism, sleeping exactly 6 standard hours per operational cycle regardless of battlefield conditions. It was a point of personal pride. It was also, she understood, becoming increasingly impossible. The reports coming in did not fit any known pattern. There was no unified military response to coordinate against. There was no government infrastructure to capture that would cause cascading systemic collapse. There was no central communication node to disable. Every time a Dominion force secured a position, it discovered that the position's practical function had already migrated somewhere else. A barn, a church parking lot, somebody's truck with a radio antenna duct taped to the roof. The humans weren't retreating. They were flowing. The invasion doctrine assumed a structured opponent. This opponent had no structure. It was like trying to conquer water, and they kept talking. This was the part that most unnerved the Admiral's senior staff. The humans would not stop talking to the Dominion forces. Not just fighters. Civilians constantly approaching. Troopers to ask questions, offer opinions, share food, argue about whether the conquest was technically legal under their local ordinances. Man in a barbecue restaurant in a Baleen had refused to close and was now serving both human civilians and 4 Dominion troopers who had apparently accepted his offer of free pulled pork and were sitting in a booth listening to him explain Texas history for the 3rd hour in a row. The troopers had not reported back to base when a retrieval squad was sent to collect them. 2 of the retrieval squad members also sat down and were given brisket. At hour 21, the Admiral received Select Proth's full briefing in person. The first talker was a composed individual who had negotiated with silicon-breathing gas giants and never shown visible distress. He sat down across from the Admiral and placed his translated notes on the table. These people, Selectroth said, do not believe they can lose. The Admiral waited. I don't mean that as propaganda or morale boosting self-delusion, he continued. I mean it as a genuine cognitive feature they have as a cultural and psychological foundation, a near total inability to accept the permanent relevance of being outmatched. When I presented our conquest record, the standard response was some variation of, "You haven't fought us yet." Selicroth paused. One man told me that 47 conquests just meant we hadn't met the Right species, he said it pleasantly. He was eating a breakfast sandwich, and they're military, the admiral asked. Organized, sophisticated, and now I am told quite aware of the situation and moving significant assets, but the military is almost secondary at this point. He touched his notes. The civilian population has in approximately 18 hours developed a distributed resistance infrastructure that spans the entire targeted region with no central authority directing it. There is no head to remove. Every person appears to have decided individually and without coordination that they are personally responsible for the outcome of this event. There was a long silence on the flagship bridge. Pull up the engagement casualty summary, the admiral said. Quietly, the numbers appeared on screen. The Dominion had lost to what their systems classified as irregular engagement, civilian interference, and equipment malfunction. 47 of the most advanced survey drones in the fleet, one dropship that had been surrounded by pickup trucks until its pilot agreed to a 3-hour candor session and signed several hats in one full combat squad that was still eating barbecue. They had taken zero territory that was currently under meaningful Dominion control, and every hour more humans were arriving. Not fleeing, arriving from all directions. The surveillance data showed traffic flowing toward the alien contact zones, not away from them. On every road, in every county, the vehicles were pointed inward toward the ships, toward the fight, toward the thing that everyone else in the galaxy would have been driving away from. The admiral had conquered worlds. She understood power. She understood force and doctrine and the mathematics of overwhelming superiority. What she was watching was something that did not fit any of her mathematicals into this frameworks, because the mathematics assumed a population that made rational assessments of survival probability. These people had looked at 3,000 warships and decided that was interesting. She made her decision at hour 23 and 18 minutes. The order went out at dawn. The ships began rising from Texas airspace with a slowness that was Supreme Admiral Vrakindra would later admit to her general staff entirely intentional. She did not want to appear to be fleeing. She was not fleeing. She was making a strategic reassessment based on new information. Distinction mattered to her. Professionally, the final transmission from the flagship was broadcast across all frequencies into Texas airspace and translated in real time on every radio station in the state. It said in the Supreme Admiral's measured professional tone, "Humanity, you are not what we expected. This engagement has been logged as inconclusive. We will require further study before establishing a revised operational framework. This withdrawal is temporary." Earl, the gas station cashier who had opened his store at 7:43 a.m. despite 3,000 alien ships in the sky overhead, was listening to the radio when the transmission played. He heard it, nodded once, turned the volume back down, and rang up a customer's Red Bull and beef jerky. The customer, watching the ships disappear into the clouds, said, "Think they'll come back?" Earl considered this maybe. He said, "But not on a Monday." Galactic Dominion spent the next 4 standard years, roughly 11 Earth years, studying the Texas incident in their war colleges. They never could fully classify it. The official strategic assessment called humanity a prematurity civilization with non-standard threat Profiles in abnormal conflict. Resolution psychology, which was the Dominion's way of saying they weren't sure if humans were brave or crazy, and weren't confident there was a meaningful difference between the two. Sellicroth wrote a personal memoir about his 2 hours with Bert in that meadow. Outside of Bailing, it was translated into 47 languages and read by every species in the Galactic Dominion. The chapter about the conversation eventually became required reading in Dominion Diplomatic Training. The chapter was titled Indirect Translation. From the Dominion tongue when they said no and meant it, Doris kept the library open through the entire 48 hours. She did close 20 minutes early on the second day because she'd run out of the good tea and she wasn't going to run a crisis coordination center without proper tea. Her city council submitted a formal commendation for her service. She thanked them and asked if they could finally approve the budget for a new graphic novel section which they had been debating for 3 years. They approved it unanimously that same afternoon. Without any further discussion, Bert's Lamesa Tornadoes went 8-3 that season. He says the alien invasion didn't affect his preparation at all. His quarterback says that's not entirely true, that after a bowling coach, Mallister stopped ever using the word impossible in practice, which had certain effects on the team's belief in what they could do on a Friday night. They made the playoffs. Randy drove home from a bailing, made lunch, watched the afternoon news coverage of the invasion, and fell asleep in his recliner before the ships had fully cleared the atmosphere. When his daughter called to ask if he was okay, he told her everything was fine, told her about the alien he'd nearly run over in the Bass Pro parking lot, and asked if she was coming for Thanksgiving because he needed to know how many briskets to smoke. She said yes. He said good. The ships never came back, not to Texas. Not yet, but somewhere in the Galactic Dominion's War College on a wall next to strategic maps of 47 conquered worlds. There is a notation added after the Texas incident that reads, in the common galactic script, a warning that translates roughly as this: if the objective requires their cooperation, ask; if it requires their defeat, recalculate; if it is Monday morning, reconsider entirely. This has been a story about humanity. It's always been a story about humanity and the thing about humanity, the thing that every alien species that has ever looked through a telescope and wondered about us needs to understand is that we have never, not once in our entire history, looked at something bigger than us and thought that means we're done. We look at something bigger than us and we think, huh, that's interesting, I wonder what it wants, and then we go talk to it. If you want more stories about humanity doing what humanity does best, surviving, adapting, refusing to accept the premise, and occasionally eating barbecue while doing it, the next video is right there. And if this story hit different, share it with someone who needs reminding that the species that put footprints on the moon and still argues about football on Monday morning is not a species that goes down easy. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay stubborn, and maybe avoid Texas on a